What I want to argue is that in the Old Covenant, we read, let me find that specific passage so that I read it to you rightly, in Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And what I want us to try to see and to understand is that the seventh day in the Old Covenant was holy because that's when God rested. The first day in the New Covenant is holy because that's when Christ rested. That's when Christ completed all of his labor, all of what he needed to do for redemption. Okay? Do you follow that? I mean, that's because that's just, then it's like, oh, okay. And I think that Hebrews 3 and 4 sort of gets us there, or helps us get there. So, as I said, Hebrews 3 and 4, it's sort of a complex argument. So just, backing up a minute, the book of Hebrews, or the letter of Hebrews, it's actually, I believe it was a sermon preached of Hebrews. I'm not, it's not a hill I would die on, but I don't think Paul was the author of Hebrews. I think it was somebody else, but nonetheless, like I said, it's not a hill I would die on. But there's just a lot in Hebrews that's very different than the other writings of Paul, and that's what makes scholars question whether and it doesn't say it was Paul either. So, historically, the church believed it has been Paul who wrote Hebrews. But anyway, it's written to Jewish Christians who were tempted to return to Judaism. So Jewish Christians who were tempted to return to Judaism, to reject Christ. And the whole point of it is that Christ is the greater. And why would you go to the lesser if you have the greater, right? That's really what Hebrews is doing, just looking at it broadly. So he is greater than the angels. He's greater than Moses. He's greater than Aaron and the Levitical priesthood. He's greater than the temple, greater than the sacrifices, greater than our traditions. Jesus is greater than all of these, right? So that's what Hebrews really is pressing for. And in Hebrews 3 and 4, it's really about Jesus being a faithful high priest. It's about Jesus being a faithful high priest. If you look back at chapter 2, verses 17 and 18, it says this: "Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." So that's the one side of, then you have 3 verse 1. And then at 4 verse 14 it says this: "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." And so what I just want to say about that is that these two passages are sort of envelope chapters 3 and through 4:13, and that's a unit. So from 3:1 to 4:13, I'm arguing is basically one unit of argument that the writer of Hebrews is bringing out. Okay, so Jesus is the faithful high priest, and so in 3 verses 1 through 6, Jesus is greater than Moses. Let me grab that here. Where it says this: "Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are the house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. So Jesus is greater than Moses in that passage. And then from verses 7 through verse 11, it's really a quote, isn't it, of Psalm 95, a passage I think we're very familiar with, and it brings out the fact that today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, and so forth. So it's quoting Psalm 95 and repeating the history of Israel in the wilderness, where they hardened their hearts. And in verse 11 it says, "So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." And again, what I said is this is a rather complex argument, so you kind of need to follow along, and hopefully, it'll become clearer as we go through that. But then when you get to verse 12, then there's, while it notes that they did not enter my rest, it also indicates that there are those who do enter God's rest. And that in other words, there are some who will enter God's rest. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. And so don't be among those who didn't enter the rest. Be among those who did enter the rest is really what it's driving at, okay? And then if we just jump ahead a little bit to 4 verse 2, Old Testament Israel had heard God's word of promise, the good news, and some did not believe. We also have been given that good news, and we must believe. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. And so it's still bringing out that same argument. They didn't believe, and they didn't enter God's rest. We also have heard the good news. Don't be like them, okay? But we might enter God's rest. And then verses 6 and verse 8 of chapter 4, there yet remains a rest for the people of God. And I want you to note that throughout all of this, it is God's rest. If we look at 3:11, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. In 3:18, and to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? 4 verse 1, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Again, verse 3, they shall not enter my rest. Again, the quote. It's God's rest. And it's focusing, isn't it, on God's rest from creation. Verse 4, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Of course, that's what I read just a moment ago in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 of Genesis. Okay? So it's speaking about the rest that God had after he created all things. And that rest, it's the rest of God, that rest can still be entered into, verses 6 through 8. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter it because of disobedience, make sure you don't, is what it's saying. So we can enter God's rest. Now, verse 8 is very interesting. If Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So what's it saying there? Well, they could argue in the wilderness that we need to get to the promised land, and that will be our rest. Or that's the rest we need to enter into, the rest of the promised land. And here, the writer of Hebrews is saying, no, that's not it. That's not the rest that we're talking about. If Joshua had accomplished that, then we wouldn't be speaking of another day of rest. They would have already had that rest. There's more to it, right? There's more rest. There's another day of rest that we're speaking of. And then verses 9 and 10, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from the works as God did from his. Now, a couple of things I want to bring out in these passages, particularly these verses 9 and 10. I see here I'm going quickly, and I'm probably going to be finishing everything that I have for this question on the Sabbath today, and so I'm going to have to think long and hard about next Sunday, because we only have one Sunday of Sunday school. Remember, there's two, but Tim's going to be taking one of them for his presentation, so I only have one to do. So I'm going to have to think about that. So this is what goes through a teacher's mind as he's trying to teach you through these things. So, but anyway, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I want to bring out a few things in these passages, and they're Greek things that I think might be helpful. What we have translated here, at least in the ESV, there remains a Sabbath rest, is an interesting word in Greek. It is sabbatismos. And so obviously we hear Sabbath in there, but then it's ismos is the latter part of that word. And this is the only place in the New Testament where that word is found. Sabbatismos. In other words, every other place where it talks about rest, it is the katapausin. But this is like there remains a Sabbathing for the people of God. It's kind of how you might read it. Now the Septuagint actually does use the word. So again, now you need to put on your thinking caps. The New Testament, of course, is right Matthew to Revelation, written in Greek and so forth. That's the New Testament. But the Septuagint is the what we know as the Old Testament that was that scribes put into Greek. So they took the Hebrew and they translated it to Greek, and that Greek translation of the Old Testament is the Septuagint. Okay, just that you understand that. Sabbatismos, that word, is used in the Septuagint, okay? And it always refers to Sabbath observing or to Sabbath keeping, which is interesting that it's translated, there remains a Sabbath rest, because we could say, and we might use some argument to saying, there remains a Sabbath observance or a Sabbath keeping for the people of God, okay? And then verse 10, it says this, our English says, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. I want to give you a more precise reading from the Greek. It would be this. For the one who has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. Now you will notice I changed what we have saying whoever to the one who has entered God's rest. And the reason I think that that's a better translation is because that verse begins with a definite singular pronoun. So the one who, it's a definite singular pronoun. Whoever is very indefinite, but the one who did this, who entered rest. And what I would want to argue is that I think, given the whole argument that is being made, that the one who entered God's rest is Christ himself. I think it's a reference to Christ. And I think that fits the argument. I do want to say, there are some who believe this and who agree with this, and see that. Others not. It would have been great if he says, and Christ who entered his rest, but he says the one who entered his rest. For the one who has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. And so I believe that this is, verse 10 is a reference to Christ, and the resurrection marks the completion of his work and his rest. And so it's making that comparison, even as God rested, now Christ rested from his labors, and that was the first day of the week. And then let us therefore strive to enter that rest. So, coming all down to it, I think when you look at all of the New Testament and you see this passage as I think it's arguing, the Sabbath observance or Sabbath keeping and resting is now the first day of the week. That's the day that the Lord of the Sabbath rested from his work. So, any comments, questions? Yes.
How do you handle pastors, those who are in works of mercy, so like Scott working today, off tomorrow? Is today this is the Lord's day, he's not here, you're working. Is there a place for there to be some sort of Sabbath keeping, not on a Sunday, for that? Because I've heard both sides of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is Sunday, this is the day that happens, you can't move that.
Yeah, so, so the question is, for those who we have recognized, who are working, laboring for, to save life, they're doing works of mercy in doctors, nurses, first responders, these kind of things. We always have recognized that that's valid. They cannot be worshiping. They cannot, so forth. So, but the question is then, can they kind of approach a Sabbath rest on another day? Is that right?
Or ought they to?
Or ought they to?
Yeah,
Oh,
either or.
yeah.
Any of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is a very interesting thought, because I don't want to take away from the fact that I do believe that the first day of the week is the Sabbath day. It's the day that it's the New Testament Sabbath. So I don't want to really take that away. But nonetheless, part of the Sabbath, part of the purpose of the Sabbath is for us to rest from our regular labors. And so that's an aspect of it that I think somebody who is involved in, works of mercy and so forth can enjoy that aspect of the Sabbath on another day. Obviously, Scott can't come here and, it's very unlikely that I would, preach a sermon to just a Scott on Tuesday morning, right? That's probably not going to happen. So in that case, there is something missed, right? There is something that's not. There is a missing of being under the Word, which is part of the Sabbath rest, and also our works of, as I've called it before, works of piety or works of devotion. That these are things that we should be engaged in. But somebody in such a situation or such an occupation, again, can mitigate that, right, through their own devotion, through their, listening to sermons, things like that. But I certainly wouldn't want to say that, that's sort of their own personal Sabbath. You know what I mean? So I'm hesitant to say that. Again, we recognize that there are these occupations that take our beloved brothers and sisters away from the regular Sunday worship and such things, communion and fellowship that we enjoy. And yeah, that's, this side of glory.